we put it this, I'm just putting the record on. This will be recorded and will be on the, we'll have a YouTube site to post on our website sometime in the next day or two.
Great, thanks everyone. So we're here together to learn about caterpillars, connections, and why biodiversity matters with Mr. Sam Jaffe of the Caterpillar Lab. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm Sonia Wadman, and I'm the Executive Director of the Waltham Land Trust. Just a few words about our wonderful community group. The Waltham Land Trust mission is to promote, protect, restore, and acquire open space. We're very much like a friends group, like a friends of our river or friends of our parks. We have events throughout the year, every month, and usually they're in-person events. We have had to, of course, limit the number of those and people participating, so we've moved into Zoom programming, and we're really happy for it because we've had some great Zooms with people all over the country as attendees, and that's been really fun. But we are a membership organization, which means that most of our funding comes from people like you who give us dues once a year. And we think it's quite reasonable. It's only $25 for an individual or $50 for a household. And not only can your dues help us pay for wonderful Zoom presenters like Sam and Barbara Bates, who we had last week, but we have volunteers who help us remove trash and invasive plants. And these are our stewards. So we need to buy tools for them and pay trainers to teach them what to do. As you know, our mission is to save land that's at risk. So sometimes we have campaigns for land conservation that require us to do some things that need money. So, so that's very helpful when we have dues for that. We have trail guides that we put along the Western Greenway Trail. On our website, you can get them at walthamlandtrust.org. But some people like to have something physical in their hands. So we print them off, and gosh, that's expensive because people have been taking our maps like crazy. Everyone's outside wanting to know where they're going and where they've been. So I have just actually placed an order for about 1,000 trail guides. So help us pay for those. And dues also go to pay for me, the Land Trust sole staff person, and also for our office space, which is at the Waltham Field Station. And we've been getting a great deal from UMass on our rents, but we fear it might go up once the city takes over. So we need help with that. And of course, your dues go towards a whole lot of other important things that we do. Members also get our twice a year newsletter, which is really cool. We go in depth into projects that we've been working on, or we talk about historical aspects of the open space that we take care of. And in fact, this year, we're gonna have some articles that go into detail about the lands that Cornelia Warren has donated to the city of Waltham and UMass and everywhere. Ms. Warren, of course, is Waltham's huge benefactor who in 1921 passed away, and in her will, she donated a bunch of land. So we're in the 100th year of her death. So we're going to celebrate her in our newsletter. So you want to be sure that you get those. Our members also get discounts on our ticketed events. So if you're not already a member, please go to the walthamlandtrust.org and join us, or you can just make a donation. And those of you who are with me in my personal or in our in-person events, you know that I often bring Hootie, my donation owl, over here. So Hootie is watching over us, and Hootie is saying, please donate if you can. Thank you. Next slide. Cool. So wow, we have lots of events coming up for Earth Day. We are in Earth Month, people. So Earth Day itself is Thursday, April 22nd. And if you do nothing else to celebrate Earth Day, please go to Jake and Joe's or order food from them. You can get takeout or you can dine in. They have a lovely patio space, and that's located at 1265 Main Street in the Market Basket Shopping Center. So that's going to be all day, and we get 20% of your food and drink sale. You have to follow the instructions, though, that's on a piece of paper that's at our website, walthamlandtrust.org. Also on that day, the 22nd, we're going to have a couple of cleanups along the Charles where we'll be picking up litter. And there's some litter there. So this information, how you can register, is going to be on our website very soon. I would say by the end of this week, that'll be up. And then on Saturday, the 24th, we're going to have other cleanups along the soon to be Mass Central Rail Trail. And that too, registration will be on walthamlandtrust.org very soon. So please check back to our website. Next slide. All right, and now I'm going to introduce Diana Young. Diana, Program Committee Chair.
Okay, I'm just going to lay out just a little bit how we're going to operate tonight. This is a Zoom webinar, so you're only going to see us. And during his talk, you're only going to see Sam and what he's presenting. We ask you to please put questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. We've disabled the chat because it sometimes messes up the screen. And we'd also ask you not to use the raise your hand feature. At the end, when we close down this meeting, you're going to see a survey that comes up. It's just 4 questions, 3 of which are just yes or no's. And we'd really appreciate if you could answer it to get some information about how people hear about the programs that we're holding and who you are. So if you would, we'd really appreciate it. We'll mention that again at the end of the program. At this point, I'd like to introduce Scott Shore. Scott is going to introduce our speaker for today, and he's looking a little like Alistair Cook there with his cat and there in the chair. So Scott, take it away.
Thanks. Okay, Samuel Jaffe is a New England-based naturalist, photographer, and educator who has been working with native insects since a very early age. Sam grew up in eastern Massachusetts chasing birds, mucking through ponds, and turning over leaves. For the last decade, he has been photographing and filming caterpillars and organizing programs to promote these special creatures to the public. In 2013, Sam founded the Caterpillar Lab, a nonprofit educational outreach organization in Marlborough, New Hampshire, and he now travels across the country working with universities, museums, botanic gardens, nature centers, and schools, helping native insects find their place in our everyday and professional lives. When he is not behind the camera or tending his zoo of caterpillars, you can invariably find Sam up to his waist in vegetation.
Okay. Here, let me spotlight you, Sam.
Sure. Thank you.
Barbara, you want to take that slide down? There.
All good to go? All right. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I don't know. Thank you to the Waltham Land Trust for bringing me back to Eastern Massachusetts again. As you just heard, I grew up in Newton, and all the green spaces, all of the vacant lots and the rail trails and the aqueducts that I explored as a kid, all the places that I learned about caterpillars and all of these insects, all of the natural world, they're places that I guess we could say we share. They're Cold Spring Park in Newton, they're Great Meadows in Concord, and the various bike trails throughout. These are the places that I made all my initial discoveries, that I learned about these creatures, that I was able to teach about these creatures to anybody who would walk by. So a lot of what I say today, a lot of the big ideas and a lot of the little stories, they all come from places that you guys are familiar with. In a sense, they come from your backyard. So I love that relevance. I want to tell you a bit about the Caterpillar Lab, where all that exploring as a kid led to the space that I'm in today. But I sort of want to scratch that for a moment and just describe some of the fun things I've been doing because it's spring now. I'm so happy that it's April. I'm so glad that up here in New Hampshire, the weather's finally warmed a little bit. And I've spent the last few days really getting into the wildlife here, partly to prepare for this talk so that I have actual creatures to show you. I think it began about 3 weeks ago. I bought a whole bunch of bananas and I let them rot on my counter at home. They got really smelly and covered in fruit flies. Girlfriend really appreciated that. I then took those bananas and I mushed them up. I added brown sugar and beer and molasses to that and let it ferment in my front entryway. And that's actually sort of a spring ritual for a lot of strange bug, especially strange moth people here in New England. That all ferments and it becomes moth bait. And last night, in preparing for the next sort of 3 days of warm weather, I took it outside, had a paintbrush, and I painted this mixture all over the trees. And I'm expecting tonight to see dozens, probably a dozen species, maybe dozens and dozens of individual moths that have overwintered on that bait, sipping it up. And I'll be able to identify those moths, photograph them, and even get eggs from them if they're females so that we can start our caterpillar season here. I think the first time I did that was as a little kid with my grandfather in August looking for underwings. So us naturalists and bug people do some weird stuff, but I am in a race to see those moths, and that's because of the thing behind me. This is a microscope here, and it's on a beautiful flower. Some of you may recognize this, or it may just look absolutely exquisite and alien. Here we go. This is a red maple twig with red maple flowers. And this occurrence, the flowering of red maple and silver maple in New England in spring, is a huge natural occurrence every year. This is going to be the food for countless insects that are basing their entire life history on this early spring world. As soon as this flowers in earnest, all those moths that I want to find at my bait will disappear because they'll be all up in the trees using the red maple flowers. As soon as these flower, those moths disappear, but they are also laying eggs on these flowers. So I'll be able to search as these age and find tiny little caterpillars using them as well. Really, every little step along the way in New England right now, everything that opens, that leaves out, every skunk cabbage that pushes through the leaf litter, it all represents, this world opening up, not just the individual species like the flower in front of you, but all the things that will sort of collide with that will eat it or pollinate it. So it's just an exciting time of year. Other things I did today, I went into a sphagnum bog and looked for pitcher plant caterpillars, which will get to be part of our talk today. And I crawled on my hands and knees looking for tiny little caterpillars inside of grass and sedge leaves. So there's a lot going on outside, and this is when I start to perk up. I'm a pretty bad New Englander because I get a little moody in the wintertime. But now that we've reached April, it's all getting a lot better. All right, so to give you a brief overview of the lab, all of this excitement about caterpillars, natural history that came out of growing up in Eastern Massachusetts in those green spaces led me to want to pursue some kind of topic of natural history or biology as a career. I went to school for evolutionary biology and ecology. I worked in a lab for a time. But it wasn't until I started photographing these creatures that I'm going to talk about today that I really sort of found my path forward. I showed photographs of native caterpillars in local museums and nature sanctuaries. And as soon as those were up on the wall, I got to watch people discover them. I saw people come in and just exclaim that they had no idea that these creatures were around here, that they didn't know that there were caterpillars with inflatable tails or false eye spots or that look like twigs in their gardens and in their parks. They would move right up to them, investigate them, and if they saw me hanging out, sort of creepily watching as a young photographer, wanting to see how they interacted, they'd start asking me questions. And that was really my first chance to be an educator. It was addictive. I mean, I got to talk about caterpillars all day long to people who actually wanted to know about them. And those galleries became the first Caterpillar Lab shows. A lot of galleries would invite me to have openings, and they're expecting wine and cheese. And I brought wine and cheese and open air displays of caterpillars on their host plants. So we'd have a room full of people with, I don't know, hot dog size hickory horn devil and cecropia caterpillars and twig mimics and woolly bears and everything else. And to see people's interest get sparked, to see people see these creatures for the first time and make that connection that they're local, that was really addictive to me. So the Caterpillar Lab is where I am now. Microscope station behind me. I'm in the museum space where we invite groups in. We've got a rearing room back here where we rear maybe 600 species of native caterpillar a year and develop all of our programs. And we also have a research space and a photography studio. So a lot goes on here, all centered along caterpillars, and all with the purpose, the mission of just opening people's eyes up to this incredible world around them. I'm going to start sharing a little slideshow now. Just give me a second. Great. All right, I hope everyone is seeing that. So the Caterpillar Lab programs that began at those photo galleries, they haven't remained the same over the last 10 years that I've been running. They started off sort of like the photographs, looking at a caterpillar as this incredible object, isolated in time, isolated from the larger context of the natural world, this really charismatic, weird thing that people got to investigate very closely. That definitely sparked interest. But that wasn't the end of these creatures' stories. There was a lot more to them. And over the last decade, we've looked closer and closer, both for engaging our audiences and frankly, just so that we can keep discovering more and more about them. And now when we do a program, it's not just about the caterpillar. It's about the caterpillar through time as it grows and changes and sheds and pupates and emerges as an adult. It's the caterpillar in space. It's, you know, where it lives. Is it nocturnal? Is it diurnal? It's the caterpillar across all of its interactions with the natural world. So what is it eating? What are its relationships with its plants? And what is eating it? Who is consuming the caterpillar? So now when we do a program, we found amazing techniques of bringing all of that right in front of people to experience sort of in real time, physically, that whole story of a caterpillar, no longer the isolated creature, but the creature and the entire context of that creature in the natural world. So that's what this talk today is built around. We want to look at caterpillars. We want to look at them as individuals and delve into the tiniest and most specialized stories. But we want to do that so we can create this overarching image of what a caterpillar represents, see the incredible biodiversity that's wrapped up in their lives, and try and figure out by the end of this, you know, why does biodiversity really matter? So I want to sort of get started on this journey, and we're going to do that sort of by constructing a caterpillar through the talk. I'm going to very briefly touch on caterpillar life history and metamorphosis. So again, sort of in isolation, but how does a single species of caterpillar grow and change? I then want to look at something very important, host-plant relationships and herbivory. Herbivory, something many of us don't want to see in our gardens, but something that I hope I'll convince you is incredibly important. And we're going to look at diversity of these creatures. So, you know, here they are going through their life cycles. Here they are eating all of these plants and having these relationships with plants, but how many species are actually out there doing that? Once we've gotten that far, we're going to turn everything on its head. And instead of looking at what caterpillars consume, we're going to look at all the things that consume caterpillars. And there's a lot of surprises there. And we'll tell an incredible story at the end of this that has a lot of players coming together just for a caterpillar to sort of be with us. And some of that involves really amazing and unexpected mutualisms. After we tell all these stories, I just want to take a minute to see what it all adds up to. Again, sort of approach that, why does this matter? Why is biodiversity important aspect? And maybe talk a little bit about what we can do to preserve this diversity in Waltham, in Eastern Massachusetts, or anywhere that we live. All right, I hope that sounds good. Normally I'd look for a thumbs up, but I'm just talking to myself here today. Let's get going. All right, so life cycles, something you might have encountered in third grade, but also something beautifully complex. The basic life cycle of a lepidopteran, a moth or butterfly, is egg, caterpillar or larva, pupa, and adult. But it's not really so simple as that. Even within just one stage, you can have dramatic change. We've got a species here, one of my all-time favorites, it's the Abbott's sphinx. And the Abbott's sphinx is a transformer. Even within the caterpillar stage, it's going to shed its skin a number of times, and it grows from being this pale blue caterpillar with an orange horn to being this big brown and green polka dotted caterpillar with a false eye on its rear end. These transformations are actually quite common in the caterpillar world. So a lot of caterpillars start out looking one way and change as they grow. One of the things I like about that is this small caterpillar, the blue one, that's leading its own ecological life. They feed on grape and Virginia creeper. The small blue caterpillars are mimicking a noxious sawfly larva, a kind of stingless wasp larva that birds don't want to eat. And because of that mimicry, they're sitting right up on top of the leaves where everyone can see them. As they grow, they shed their skin and they become this bark mimic or almost a cluster of grapes mimic. And they have the false eye, and they spend a lot more time hidden down deep in the leaves on the vines, where a bird might discover them, but not realize they're not actually a snake when they find them. So they're changing their position in the world. Their predators are changing just because their bodies are changing. When they're done being a caterpillar, they go underground and they become the pupa. And the pupa has a completely different life compared to the caterpillar. The caterpillar is on the leaves, eating and growing. The pupa is resting underground. The things that it interacts with are completely different than what the caterpillar does. Maybe a mole or a vole is a bigger concern than a bird. And finally, when the adult emerges, it's like we have a completely new organism altogether. We've got the abbot sphinx moth. It flies and makes a buzzing sound. It's thought to mimic a bumblebee, and it's a champion pollinator in early spring. So this one organism, the abbot sphinx, has all these different ecological lives as it goes through its metamorphosis. And I just want you to remember that as I go through the talk, and I speak a lot about caterpillars and their interactions, that every creature we look at will have, the egg stage, the caterpillar stage, the pupa, and the adult, and they're all living complex lives. I like to focus on the caterpillars for a number of reasons. I mean, one, they're just often overlooked compared to the bright active butterflies on the flowers. The caterpillars are like unsung heroes, or maybe not even considered heroes at all. But also, I really do believe they are some of the sort of heavy lifters of the ecological world here. They're doing some things, they are performing some ecological services very, very efficiently compared to other organisms. Right there at the top, they are eating a lot of leaves. They are consuming more green material than just about anything else in our forested ecosystems, and that's doing a lot for the environment. They're also providing a lot of food for other things. So they're eating all those leaves, and then that energy is going out in the mouths of birds and in wasps and flies. So let's start with an aspect of that. This is a Lithophony grotii, Groat's pinion, and it's eating some of these red maple flowers that I showed you under the microscope earlier. This is tremendously important. This is not gross or bad, or this isn't taking away from nature. This is an ecological function here, an ecological service that we couldn't live on this planet without, and that most of the natural world depends on. This is a caterpillar sort of at its best. This is a native species eating a native flower, and it's converting energy that just would otherwise be locked up forever. I mean, plants are great at drawing down energy from the sun, and they bring up resources through their roots. But without things to eat those plants, everything just stops there. And we need this army of leaf eaters. We need herbivory, healthy numbers of herbivores to release that energy the plants put together and distribute it around to the rest of the natural world. It's funny to me that most people seeing a hole in a leaf or a damaged flower, a petal that's been torn or gobbled on, see that as sort of a negative aspect. I mean, we'll watch a bumblebee visit a flower to pollinate. We'll watch a bird eat a caterpillar. And I think we all believe that's actually good, that's healthy, that's as it should be, that's nature being healthy. But when you watch a caterpillar eat a leaf, we all go, oh, that can't be right. Or you see a tree that's been absolutely ravaged, full of holes in the spring, that maybe that's really unhealthy. In fact, if we're talking about native species interacting, we should all be very glad that that's happening. I wonder if some of our hesitance, if some of the barrier we have to appreciating this the same way we do other sort of natural occurrences, comes from our agrarian history. I mean, for so long, we had to, support our gardens. We had to protect them from the rabbits and the caterpillars so we could have vegetables. We might have been growing flowers for a flower show and didn't want the roses with the holes in the petals. But when we start thinking about the natural world as a whole, we can't think like that anymore. And the natural world now is often not so far away. It's not our little gardens and then all of nature. So much of nature is now incorporated into where we live, into our backyards and into those rail trails in the public parks, that we need to start recognizing that a caterpillar like this one eating a flower or a leaf is a really important thing. That video I put up last year, and I think it went on for about 10 minutes. People told us on our social media that they sort of found it very calming, and they would just put it on in the background and watch that caterpillar eat on repeat for ages. I was very happy about that. So caterpillars aren't just good at eating leaves, and it's not just, you know, one green caterpillar eating one kind of leaf. Caterpillars are really champion herbivores that have developed incredibly close relationships with the plants they eat. And we're going to look at a number of examples of how caterpillars have adapted to those plants and even how those plants have adapted back to the caterpillars. So this is the four-horned sphinx, or elm sphinx. It's one of my favorite species down in Massachusetts. And it just is an incredible leaf mimic. I mean, this is a brown form that develops on dry years when there's more brown leaves around on the elm plants. The stripes on the sphinx caterpillar mirror perfectly the veins on the leaf. The horn on this sphinx caterpillar looks just like the petiole of the leaf. And if you touch this, if you pet this caterpillar, it feels exactly the same as an elm leaf, that incredible sort of soft but rough texture. In a wet year, when there's a lot of green on the trees, these will be green as well. So you can see how this caterpillar specializing on this tree has come to mirror it. The plant is not just its food, it's its entire world. I mean, it's its home, it's its backdrop, it's what it has evolved against. Another example, this is a common lytrosis, a very big inchworm, and this one spends the winter as a caterpillar. It's out there right now eating just the very first buds of spring. And there are no leaves around. So to that backdrop and with its host choice at its time of year, this is sort of the way that it's working its camouflage. There's a lot of twig mimics out there, and they're most common in this sort of overwintering, early spring and late fall. Here's a great example, the goldenrod shinia flower moth. These two caterpillars fit in perfectly amongst the goldenrod flowers. This is an interesting example. The caterpillars eat the petals here, eat the flowers, but the adult moth also rests on the plant all day and nectars at it at night. So shinia flower moths often have a relationship where the caterpillar eats the plant, but the adult moth may be a sort of devoted pollinator for that plant. I like to think that this might be a little bit of a give and take here. You know, here, eat some of my extra flowers and fruit, and I will have you move my pollen around later. The degree to how far that relationship has evolved seems to be different depending on the species of shinia. Here's another one that's really taken on the look of its plant. This is a Ligocentria lignicolor. It's an oak specialist, but not just an oak specialist, it's a late season oak specialist. So you don't want to just be a green caterpillar. If your oak leaves are already covered in rot and have been skeletonized and chewed on or have galls on them. So this caterpillar is perfectly at home in a late season sort of leafscape that includes all of those things. Another favorite, this one is definitely in Waltham and Newton and everywhere else out there. This is the decorator caterpillar. You'll first see them in June on daisy fleabane, but they don't want to limit themselves to just one flower to eat. So to be able to be camouflaged, this species picks the petals off of the plant it eats and sticks them on its back with little pieces of silk. So they sort of dress up in their host plant. It gives them flexibility. It's another example of caterpillars interacting with their hosts in slightly odd ways. This is not a camouflage caterpillar, so it's not sticking anything to its back or trying to look like a twig. This one's eating a plant, wild indigo, that has a nice suite of toxins in it, and it's used those toxins to become poisonous. It doesn't mind being seen. In fact, when I spot one of these in the wild, they're pretty easy to spot. You take a step towards them and they throw their head back over their body, their rear end up in the air, And they'll regurgitate from their head, and they sort of have a nice wet poop from the other end. So lots of chemicals going all at once right there. So this is an example of evolving with your plant, similar to how monarchs have with milkweed, to end up with defensive chemicals in your body. Okay, so those were just a few examples of caterpillars and their host plants. We work with 600 caterpillar species a year, maybe. There are something like 3,000 to 4,000 species of caterpillar in New England and 180,000 described across the world. So there are a lot of these creatures. And I wait to sort of do this little diversity slideshow here till this point, because I just want you to think as they're all going through, each one of these has those specialized relationships. You know, all of these have their specific range of host plants they'll use. They get different things from their hosts. Maybe they're mimicking them, mirroring them. Maybe they're trying to stand out because they've incorporated toxins into their body. But as I see this go by, I mean, there's almost as many host plants I could name here as the caterpillars. These are all taken at the lab over just the last few years. So we really do have a lot of caterpillars in New England, and they're pretty funky creatures. I'm sure you'll see a few weird ones as they go by. All right, I probably can't let this go on forever. There we go. All right, hi, I'm back again. So I like to incorporate things that are happening right now outside into my talks. And I've got the microscope behind me to help me do that. On the subject of host plant, I mean, I think how we started with the red maple flowers was a good one. I mean, this one flower here that's out early in the spring, the red maple, supports dozens and dozens of species of Lepidoptera. There are caterpillars that eat it. There are moths that nectar at it. As they replace red maples in eastern Massachusetts forests with things like Norway maples and other non-natives on the streets, this resource and all those species that depended on it disappear. So host is always important to remember. Basically, for any of the caterpillars that just went through in that slideshow, you take away their access to that plant and they disappear. It's that simple. And for something like a red maple or an oak tree, that's a lot of species disappearing. So we really do want to promote these big, heavy hitting species like red maple. But not all of them are, you know, big trees with lots of caterpillars. Some of them are much more specialized. And I really wanted to share this. I don't often get to have this plant as a host to a caterpillar that I'll get to show you. This is a purple pitcher plant. So I spent the day in a bog, went out to look for pitcher plant looper caterpillars. So let me start by just showing you this leaf here. All right, so here's a pitcher plant. We've got the throat here, and we've got these backward facing hairs all over the lip. This is a carnivorous plant. It attracts insects. Down in the chamber here in the pitcher, there's something sweet that attracts things like wasps and flies and anything else on the wing to it. They go inside looking for food and they can't get back out because these backward facing hairs make it impossible for them to walk up the lip. So this is sort of like a little death trap for insects, and mostly they'll capture them down below and they'll slowly be digested down at the bottom of the chamber. But there's one caterpillar up here in New England that's evolved to use this as their host, and it's the only plant they use as a host, and they've really, over evolutionary time, figured out how to use it perfectly. The relationship between the caterpillar and this plant is very, very specialized. So I'd love to show you these today. Hopefully they'll behave. So I went out looking for pitcher plants that had a little bit of silk sort of right over the entryway. You can see a little band of silk there. And looking closer, I noticed that some of them had been skeletonized. So that means the tissue on the sort of side of the pitcher had been eaten off. And a lot of them were full of frass pellets. So this is a pitcher that's been quite well devoured by caterpillars. And over here, we can actually see them. These are the pitcher plant looper caterpillars. Really unique species. There's another species that uses only 1 or 2 pitcher plant species in the Southeast, but this is the only one that lives up here in New England. And its whole world is a pitcher plant. It eats a plant that is eating all the other insects that go near it. It uses that plant for protection. It spends the winter inside of a pitcher. It silks close the entry into a balloon. It eats from the inside. It's basically, through its specialization, managed to do things that no other insect could. And I've got some images of what these closed pitchers look like. Here we go. So here are the pictures as I found them last year. As the caterpillars had overwintered in them, they silk over the top. They crawl around inside when it gets warm enough in the spring. They just scrape off the inner surface of the leaf and they can mature in entirety in there. One reason I collected them again this year is I'm very curious if these might have sort of highly specialized things that eat them. We're going to talk about this later, but caterpillars have a lot of parasitoids, wasps and flies, which use them as a host. To get your egg into a caterpillar like this, you really have to know what to do. You're going to have a ovipositor that can pierce the pitcher and get into the caterpillar inside. So I keep hoping that we will find some kind of parasitoid in these caterpillars. Here's two of them on the inside of a dissected pitcher. And here's the beautiful moth that they become. Tiny but gorgeous and highly specialized, highly local, just in a bog. But wherever you have a bog, you tend to find these guys. Okay, let me just put this away so they don't crawl off across the counter. So our next creature, I wonder how many of you are sort of angrily rolling your eyes at this beast here, is a little different than our tiny pitcher plant caterpillars that nobody ever sees. This is a backyard caterpillar. This is the tobacco hornworm. And these specialize on plants that we like to eat. These will eat tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, nightshades. I usually, I love to look at my audience at this point and see the different reactions to this creature. I know it's hard to watch your tomatoes get devoured, and you have every right to protect your tomatoes, but this really is one of my absolute favorite insects. The tobacco hornworm, Manduca sexta, it's a native insect. It's one of our largest native caterpillars. It's highly specialized. It has incredibly interesting evolutionary dynamics with its host plants and with the things that eat it. And if you take a moment to just think about what makes this creature interesting, I think you'll get a lot more from your interactions with them in your backyard. So I like to think of the tobacco hornworm as, I'd say, a horticulturalist and as a farmer. And I'm going to explain what I mean. And they really have to do with different time scales here. So they're horticulturalists because they have affected the plants they eat in a real central way over evolutionary time. These caterpillars, the Manduca genus, have been eating the Solanaceae plants. That's the family of plants that includes tomato and pepper and others for a very, very long time. And those plants have reacted to that pretty intense herbivory pressure by evolving different chemicals to try and keep them from eating them. So these would be anti-herbivory chemicals or toxins. So the plant evolves something in its leaf that's poisonous, toxic to the caterpillar. The caterpillar can't eat that plant as well, and the plant will thrive. But over time, the caterpillar overcomes those toxins. It's able to eat the plant again. It can either digest those toxins, extract them and use them, or just pass them through its body. And the caterpillar is going to win for a while. The plant has to up it. It'll get even more toxic, more chemicals. We have this back and forth where basically the plant is getting more and more toxic in more and more different ways. And the caterpillar is getting to be able to handle the most ridiculous amounts of chemicals. There are many Solanaceae plants that we can't even touch, let alone eat, because they're so toxic. And a hornworm like this one could just graze on the leaf, no problem. I think this is really interesting. I mean, the caterpillar has been transformed by its relationship with the plant, and the plant has been transformed by the caterpillar. This is interesting to us too. A lot of the flavors in something like a tomato are actually related to the chemicals in the tomato that evolved as anti-herbivory chemicals. That would be true about things like the bitter taste in the Brassicaceae, things like broccoli and mustard has this bitter taste. That's a chemical that evolved in response to being eaten by a caterpillar, like the cabbage white caterpillar. toxins, anti-herbivory chemicals are flavor. So I wonder if some of the things that drew us to these plants in the first place, our original farmers, were drawn to the tomato family or the brassica. Some of those flavors that made us start to interact with these plants and breed them and cultivate them were actually only there in the first place because of their evolutionary relationship with something like a hornworm. So I really like to think of them as horticulturalists. They're designing these plants and designing them in ways that might end up being interesting to us. So doesn't help you keep your tomatoes if they're out there eating them, but maybe makes you appreciate them a little bit more. So here's that interaction we were talking about. We post this on Thanksgiving most years. I forgot to actually say there's a really curious thing they get from eating tobacco. Nicotine is an anti-herbivory toxin. And these caterpillars, they can't incorporate nicotine into their bodies. They can't just pass it through. They store it as a gas right near their breathing holes or spiracles. And they've turned it into a defensive strategy. So if a hornworm is attacked by a wolf spider, or if I poke it with my finger, they'll actually burp nicotine gas out of their spiracles as a defense. There was a great paper called Toxic Halitosis by the tobacco hornworm that we discovered a few years ago, and we now use that as a talking point all the time at the lab. I also said they were like farmers, and that has to do with their whole story, with what they become one day. So the caterpillar is eating the plants, but the adult moth, the Carolina sphinx, it has the longest tongue of any pollinator in New England. And it's able to pollinate plants in that family, Solanaceae, that nothing else can pollinate. So here we've got one pollinating a datura. I love this idea. We've got the caterpillar eating the plant, the adult moth is pollinating it, basically helping it spread. We've got farmers here, relates to us very well. We cultivate these plants, we grow them to eat them, just like these guys. All right, I may not have won you over for the tobacco hornworm, but at least I hope you'll consider that they are a native insect, part of our environment, and wrapped up in incredible stories. I'm going to leave herbivory behind pretty soon, but before I do, we're gonna look a little closer into some of the smaller spaces. This is an adult sedge mining moth, Cosmopteryx, and I spent some time today crawling around looking for their caterpillar. I said sedge miner, these caterpillars aren't out on leaves. These caterpillars live inside of leaves. And using our microscopes, we can see them very well. Leaf miners are very common. There are probably more species of caterpillar living inside leaves and stems than outside leaves and stems. And I'm sure there are some, in your yard or in the park down the road, maybe thousands and thousands of them. So let me stop the share here. And we're going to go back to the microscope. I need to just fiddle for a moment. Let's see if I can do this. All right, so here's what we're going to be looking in. This is a little box I made up with 3 sedge leaves in it, and we're going to backlight it under the microscope. All right. Here we go. Hope we'll get a good view. All depends if we're going to have one that's eating right now. Our best bet. Well, so you should be able to see these dark lines within the leaves. Here's one that's moving. Here's a sedge leaf. Here's a mine, sort of the material within the leaf has been eaten. Here's a little storage area for the caterpillar's frass or poop, and here's our caterpillar. So again, we're not just seeing that caterpillars eat leaves, we're seeing that caterpillars have incredible relationships with the plants they eat. Just from the pitcher plant caterpillar, highly specialized relationship with that one plant, to the hornworms developing really complex relationships over evolutionary time. And now we've got a caterpillar that is able to live in what could be a hostile environment between the upper and bottom surface of a leaf. This creature has to get into the leaf. The adult moth has to know where to lay the egg, what time of year, on what kind of shoot the caterpillar will be successful getting in there. It's got to keep the leaf from sapping up. It's got to stay, it's going to pupate in here. It'll spend the winter in this leaf. It's basically everything to this caterpillar. We use this a lot at programs to be able to look inside a single leaf, watch a caterpillar even eat cells. It's a pretty eye-opening thing. It takes a discussion of a big caterpillar eating a big leaf and just changes the entire scale of it. I mean, now that you know a caterpillar lives in a leaf, think of the woodland across from your house, something like that, with all those different trees, the sedges, the bushes, the flowers. Now, if all of those can have tiny little caterpillars living within them, it's just a huge difference. It's an order of magnitude, like how much stuff is out there. I want to move us away from simple herbivory, though, and I was really lucky to find something today to do with these that'll help us move towards predation and parasitism. So I've got another one right here, and this one does not have a live caterpillar. This is going to bring us to the other side of that whole story that we've been looking at. All right, so we have another leaf mine right here, but in that leaf mine, instead of having a caterpillar, we've got this little jelly bean-like thing right here. And if we watch it closely, I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, you might see it move. Instead of getting that beautiful little moth from this, we're going to get a beautiful tiny iridescent wasp. This is a parasitoid wasp larva. There's a caterpillar that lays its egg on a leaf of a sedge and lives its whole caterpillar and pupal life within that leaf. There is a wasp that knows just how to find that specific caterpillar at the right time of year, inject an egg into it, grow up inside of it, emerge, pupate, and fly off to find more. So this is a parasitoid wasp that specializes on sedge mining caterpillars. That just takes the idea of there being all those leaves and all those trees with all those leaf mining caterpillars, and now you add to that, the caterpillars in the leaves, but the wasps in the caterpillars in the leaves. And you see it moving. They have this amazing way of wiggling their gut like this. So this is not exceptional. This is happening all over the place. There are always things using other things. And so far, we really focused on all the plants that have all the caterpillars, right? But now we've got all those caterpillars eating the plants. There's always stuff eating those caterpillars. So here we have this obscure little creature inside of a sedge, and we've got an even more obscure little wasp that uses it as a host. Let's turn this off. Gonna share the screen again. All right, so as we enter to this next part of the talk, the things that use caterpillars, I like to read this poem to sort of set the stage. It really speaks to a lot of what we do and what we talk about here at the lab. So here we go. Great fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum. And the great fleas themselves, in turn, have greater fleas to go on, while these again have greater still, and so on. So I really think this captures the idea of, everything being used by everything else. If you've got a resource in nature, there's going to be something that uses that resource and something that uses that thing. It's an idea that we see coming through every day at our work here. I mean, every caterpillar we collect has the potential to have a parasitoid or a hyperparasitoid. But this is impressive to me. I mean, the inspiration for this poem was Jonathan Swift in 1733. In 1733, Jonathan Swift walking down the street, seeing a woolly bear, did he see that as an isolated caterpillar, or did he realize that that little creature represented this chain of things depending on other things? I'd like to see people recognize that nowadays. I hope we can all go outside and recognize that the little bumblebee at our flower is part of a much more complex whole story, that the green caterpillar eating a cabbage leaf is interacting with all kinds of things and has a sort of ecological impact much bigger than we can just see with our eyes. So we're going to talk a bit about parasitoids, and I want to start by going back to this initial caterpillar we watched a video of eating a leaf, the Lithophany grotii. To get the moth to see all the life stages like this, I usually have to rear them from eggs. If I collect this caterpillar in the wild, about 50% of the time, we're going to get not a moth, but a parasitoid. So here we've got a lithophany that's got ectoparasitic wasp larva feeding on it, the green larva, and it has a little egg of a fly on its head. So this caterpillar is being used by 2 other organisms. The green larvae finish feeding and they pupate, and you get this incredible tiny little wasp with antlers. This one caterpillar feeding on red maple flowers in spring, supporting a chain of other organisms and having that larger impact in the natural world. And we see a lot of parasitoid wasps and flies. I mean, it's constant all summer long. This beautiful ichneummonid, you might see something like this pollinating sweet pepper bush in the spring. This came out of a geometric inchworm. This one, another ichneummonid, another pollinator, came out of a woolly bear. So, you know, thank you for everything, woolly bears. I mean, we love raising those caterpillars. They're great to show kids. The moths are beautiful, but they're also supporting these other organisms with other functions in our environment. This is a very large parasitoid wasp. This one uses our lunas and cecropias and polyphemus. The big giant silk moths of North America have equally large and glorious parasitoids that use them. Native creatures using other native creatures. This is all part of the natural story. This little fly also came from a woolly bear. So there's a lot of tachinid flies that are parasitoids that you might see flying around your house in the screens. They're not all just simple house flies that came out of the trash. Some of them needed to grow up in a caterpillar. And these ones only use 2 species of caterpillar in the genus Ceratomia. These are more sphinx moths. And these are pollinators. So sometimes, again, to get a pollinator, you need a fly to grow up inside of a caterpillar. And here they are on cow parsnip. We've got, I think, 3 or 4 species of tachinid parasitoid fly here pollinating for us. All right. I should write a whole talk on parasitoids. I'm also noticing that my time is already running low, so I'm going to try to speed through to some other stories, but I am going to give us one break because there's a video that I think puts all of this together very well with the parasitoids. I was filming in the back as a bunch of braconid wasp larvae were coming out of a sphinx caterpillar. This is something we see very commonly. It's a little wasp that lays eggs into sphinx caterpillars and matures within, and then spins cocoons on the back. While I was filming, though, another little player in the game showed up. A second wasp showed up on my photo stage from somewhere in the lab. I had no idea this was going to be happening. I filmed the whole thing, and I want to spend, I think it's about 4 minutes long, let you watch it, and then we can chat about it at the end. And I'll go get a glass of water while that's happening. So, hold on. All right, we're gonna stop a little bit early here, but that still sort of ranks among the most special moments I've had here at the lab. I know it's all rather shocking. I mean, for a lot of us, watching things eat things is difficult. But to me, it also represents something rather beautiful. I mean, these interactions make each of these creatures more, not less. The fact that that Sphinx caterpillar, with its complex life history and complex relationships with its host plants, supports these specialist wasps and flies, that its story grows beyond the caterpillar to these other organisms, is amazing. And the sheer volume of it all, the fact that we do have, you know, a caterpillar for a plant and a wasp for that caterpillar and a wasp for a caterpillar for a plant. That to me is the essence of the natural world, and something I want everybody to recognize, again, as they're walking down the streets. So parasitism, although it can sometimes be stomach turning, is also something that represents something crucial. All right, share screen again. And here's our little pteromalid wasp here. So this is the hyperparasitoid that uses the braconid wasp that used our caterpillar. Here's another hyperparasitoid. So this incredible insect uses a wasp that uses fall webworms. So fall webworms are another native species. They can tie up trees with silk in the late summer, but they are hosting all these incredible insects. And of course, if there's always going to be something using something else in nature, we've got parasitoids of monarch butterflies as well. This one is highly specialized. It's a pteromalid wasp, which only lays eggs into monarch pupa. It's the only host it uses. So this little metallic creature is intimately linked with, you know, one of North America's most popular darling butterflies. Again, I don't think this takes away from the monarch. I think this makes it even bigger. We know about the monarch's relationship with its host plant milkweed. We know about the monarch needing open pollination habitat and its amazing migration. This little wasp, which has evolved because the monarch is here, this is something that adds to that story, that adds to how just majestic that creature is, to me anyways. All right, I'm actually going to skip that live view. So I'm going to end this sort of storytelling with a rather big story that has a lot of different players on it. I think it's a great sort of capstone ecological story to show what it's going to take to get a little butterfly. A story that we tell often at our programs. Last August, we did a program in Booth Bay, at the Booth Bay, Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens. And we lucked out in that we found these acorn ants out behind the building. And we found everything else that leads us from acorn ants to one of our favorite caterpillars. And we could tell a really incredible story in front of a live audience. So acorn ants are actually really common. They're things I can go outside near my house or in Cold Spring Park in Newton or anywhere really and find just by looking for last year's acorns. But it takes a lot to get acorn ants, and it takes a lot to get from acorn ants to caterpillars. And I'm going to attempt to tell that story. So to get acorn ants, we first need an oak tree. We need a large mature oak tree that's had time and stability to grow. We need it to flower and fruit, drop its acorns to the ground, and we need those acorns to survive the myriad of things that want to gobble them up. So a squirrel can't find that acorn and eat it. It can't wash down into a stream. It has to settle down on the forest floor. To get to the acorn ants, we then need that acorn to be found by a very peculiar little beetle called an acorn weevil. It has this incredibly weird curved snout, and it cuts a tiny little hole in the acorn and injects an egg inside. The acorn weevil, the larva, then eats the inside of the acorn, hollowing it out. And the next year, when it pops out of the acorn to go pupate, it leaves a little ant-sized hole behind. So these acorn weevils are creating little ant condos all over the forest floor. They're making these little hollowed out sphered acorns with an entry hole. and the ants populate them quickly. There's 3 species of acorn ant in New England forests, and many other ants that will use them. So once you get these acorn ants in a forest, or really any ants, the whole nature of that area changes. These are like keystone ecological organisms. They come in and they're predators and they're scavengers. They change the nature of the forest floor. They remove some insects, and they actually allow some insects to live where otherwise they couldn't. And one of those creatures is the next player in our story here. Okay, so this is the woolly alder aphid. Aphids rely very heavily on ants for protection. You may have noticed this in your yard. A lot of aphids will feed ants a little sugar water called honeydew. It attracts the ants drink the honeydew, and then instead of treating the ants like the aphids like a hamburger and just gobbling them up, the ants protect them more like a milk cow. Some ants will even carry these aphids around, move them to new sites, guard them from predators. I know that when I go down to get some of these woolly alder aphids that have ants on them, the ants are all over my hand biting me right away. So they're very good protectors of their aphids. Think about what it took just to get these aphids in. So these aphids really need the protection of the ants. You remove ants and you don't have the aphids anymore. So you needed an oak tree, an acorn weevil, ants to settle in. You needed the ants to find the aphids, set up their little relationship. And then with the woolly alder aphid, you needed everything it took to get the alder plant, their host plant. So you needed the swamps, the alders to grow. You needed some of those alders to be in subprime conditions, a little stressed out, which would let the aphid colonies sort of latch on. Once you have all of this, once you have the aphids, the ants, the oak, the acorns, the alder, then you can get finally to our caterpillar player. And this is a little video from our summer show.
Hi everyone, just coming to you before our program starts today. I'm setting up the microscope fodder and had some visuals that I couldn't resist sharing with you all. So I'm going to turn the camera around. Here's our microscope. Here's some of our woolly alder aphids, and we've got 2 carnivorous insects enjoying these aphids. I'm going to point it up at the screen here. We're going to see what we can find. So there's not much of the woolly alder aphids left, and we have our first beast here. This is a syrphid fly larva, one of the hoverflies, and it's sort of amazing to watch. It moves through the aphids. It doesn't have a head capsule like a caterpillar. So it just picks up the aphids with seemingly just a pointed mouth and starts chewing on them. Hopefully we'll get a better view of that in a minute. I'm going to turn our twig over. And we also had a rather large harvester butterfly caterpillar show up, seemingly overnight, or I must have shed its skin into a final instar. And this has been chewing on the remaining aphid here. Quite a striking caterpillar. So this is the fun of the microscope for me, and why I spend so much time here during a program is I get to see so many things that I've never seen before while we're talking to people. So it's sort of like we can bring that moment of discovery and the excitement of it as we're experiencing it to our audiences. Hi, buddy. So again, this is the...
So that's our critter here that we got to through that unlikely chain of relationships. This is the harvester butterfly caterpillar. It's an obligate predator. It has to eat meat. It will only eat woolly alder aphids here in New England. If you're gonna have this butterfly, you need those aphids, you need the alders, you need the ants, you need everything to come together. And of course, this isn't the end of the whole story here. The relationships continue. The harvester butterfly has its own suite of parasitoids and hyperparasitoids. It really gets to this idea of everything being a little superorganism, really everything being connected in a way beyond we tend to recognize. And it's something we champion here. So here's the adult butterfly. It'll actually nectar at the aphids. The aphids are putting out that sugar water for the ants. The butterflies come in and steal it. It's just a crazy chain of events. All right. So summing up these stories, I feel like we go through life often seeing things in the world around us, again, as these isolated objects. an acorn on the sidewalk. Unless we sit there and think about it for a minute, it's just an object. It's just an acorn. It has its own little story wrapped up in it. But we have to admit that when we look closer, when we expand our field of vision, an acorn is just a tiny part of a much larger story, right? Look up from the acorn and you have the oak tree, the trunk, the bark, the hardwood, all the things using those resources. You have the branches, the twigs, the leaves, galls on the leaves, the caterpillars eating the leaves, the wasps and flies and birds eating those caterpillars. You have got a magnificent series of connections. And I hope that we can sort of take this idea of the acorn to the oak tree and transpose that to just the little things growing in your backyard and in the spaces you're trying to conserve and preserve in Waltham. Because if we don't recognize that it's there, I don't know how we can protect it. We can look at a bird visiting a bird feeder and look to, what that needs to nest, but just trying to think of how to say this. When I see a roadside with just a tangle of different vegetation, that roadside has extreme value. If we're talking about native plants, a little bit of blueberry, a little bit of cherry, a young pine tree, I see how much goes into that, how much that supports. And I feel like if we have that perspective as we're working in our communities, we'll realize that these in-between spaces and our yards and even a park that's not looking like the great wildlands of North America has value and needs to be worked on to preserve that value. So, I hope I've convinced you that there's a lot going on out there, but why is this even important? So biodiversity, great, there's a ton of creatures out there interacting, but why should we even care about that? I like to think of biodiversity not as just the number of species that are out there, but really instead of a biodiversity of species, a biodiversity of interactions, of relationships between species. And the more of these interactions you have, the more fine-tuned they are, the more highly specialized they are, the more things using other things we have, the more checks and balances we have, the more stable and predictable year to year the natural world will be. If we have too much of something one year, there'll be other creatures there to use it and creatures to use those things later to moderate that, to stabilize the whole system. So, it comes down to why do we think that outside of human intervention, why do we think that there are always going to be leaves on the trees in the spring and enough leaves to feed caterpillars and enough caterpillars to feed the birds and so on and so on? That stability and predictability is there because of this incredible system of diverse relationships, diverse checks and balances. It's really one of nature's greatest strengths, right? It's self-moderating. It stabilizes to a point where creatures over long periods of time can evolve to that backdrop and season to season can depend on having the food they need. But it's also sort of nature's greatest weakness when you introduce human beings. We're really good at coming in and causing rapid change. We cause rapid change through chopping down a forest, overusing pesticides, making too many lawns and parking lots, through climate change, changing the weather very quickly, through all kinds of things. And every time we do that, we're breaking down some of these connections we've been talking about. We've been removing checks and balances. And that really makes me very worried, actually. The last 3 years around here, we've had these cool springs. We've had low numbers of springtime caterpillars, and the leaves have been very, very clean and untouched. And it's been a little creepy to me. I know that these leaves should be eaten. I know that they need to be eaten so the birds will have enough food. And there's a little thing in the back of my mind wondering, what of this is natural variation and what of this is something scarier going on because of everything we've been doing to the environment. There are a lot of papers that have been coming out recently on insect decline. The science of it is still up in the air. We know that insects are declining. We don't know exactly how or exactly why. But when you think of the sheer volume of species that are out there of insects compared to other things, and especially when you think of a caterpillar's role right in the middle of our food webs, we start losing those and what could happen. And I am definitely running short on time, so I'm going to skip a few things here. But as far as that what could happen, I'm going to share both some sort of sad stories and a hopeful what we can do about it. So what could happen? If we introduce a non-native species like a gypsy moth, things can go haywire. A non-native insect or a plant, they're not part of these complex whole stories that we've been talking about, not part of these series of relationships. They do exist in isolation and they can do damage to the environment. They can cause rapid change. A gypsy moth eats and eats and eats every year with nothing to moderate it, and it can cause forest decline. Very different than a native species like the eastern tent caterpillar that looks sort of similar in how they eat. You know, these can devour a whole cherry tree, but they've been here in New England for a long, long time, and lots of things use them. Their whole story is very complex, and they give back for what they take. So you introduce something like a gypsy moth and you cause change that disrupts relationships. Something like the tent caterpillar here supports those relationships. There are birds that have specially evolved to use them. The plants that they eat will leaf out again after they eat them and can usually survive their defoliation. The stories go on. Another example of changes we've made that have affected these connections. This is the Cecropia giant silk moth. People introduced a parasitic fly, a parasitoid fly called Compsoglyra to try and kill off the gypsy moths, and it went after a lot of our native species instead. So that fly has caused the Cecropia to decline and for us to lose one of those diverse interactions. Here are 3 sphinx caterpillars that feed solely on ash trees. People introduced the emerald ash borer spreading here from the Midwest, and it's killing out all the ash trees. When you think of the stories we've been telling and you start viewing ash as a superorganism, you realize we're not just at risk of losing ash, we're at risk of losing this entire community of insects and parasites and parasitoids and predators that depend on it. The Barron's buck moth here in New England depends on fire-burned habitats. By putting out all these fires, these have now become an endangered species. And the woolly bear, a species that's ubiquitous, actually seems to be struggling with climate change. As temperatures warm in the wintertime, they become active, move around, but there's no food for them to eat yet. So there's a lot of species that actually depend on stable, predictable, cooler temperatures in the winter, which could be affected by climate change. All right. So that was sort of like the bummer at the end of the talk, but I do believe there's a lot we can do about this. Once you recognize that diversity is important, that these diversity of interactions support us and everything else in the natural world, I hope there are steps we can take to make sure that it doesn't break down. At the lab, first and foremost, we really believe in improving education and awareness on the subject. My experience through the lab is that so many people don't realize that all of these creatures, all of these interactions are out there and that they're important in the first place. So if we want to preserve these insects, if we want to make sure biodiversity and all of its benefits stay around us, we really need to get out there and tell people it's happening. So I don't know if you're a birder, a bug guy like me, if you like walking or gardening, but get out there and find a way to share your knowledge of these creatures, because people don't know they're there until you tell them. The next part, I really think we need to be promoting biodiversity, big surprise, above all else. There are a lot of favorites being played right now, things that are important. You know, the monarch butterfly is the poster child of insects, pollinating bees as sort of the poster child of, let's call it, you know, ecological services, pollination, right? These are great inroads, right? This captures people's imaginations, it gets them talking about this stuff, but we need to make sure we move that conversation more towards biodiversity. The bees in our yards are not going to survive from just planting a few flowers. We need to create habitats, we need to treat spaces as habitats, and moderate all of those things that decrease biodiversity. Finally, just how we can help. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Doug Tallamy's work about how we can help make our own spaces sort of wildlife sanctuaries, national parks for all these creatures. I agree. I think we can all help by managing our own spaces. We can plant more native plants. We can expand what we protect from very specific parks to parks and roadsides and trail edges. Anywhere that there's some open space out there is an opportunity to boost all of the things we've been talking about today. One note I'll make here is that I felt like there's a hole in how people talk about how we can help. You don't need to go to a nursery and buy native plants and have a landscape put together for this. We just need to recognize where there's value and help protect it. So if there's a roadside that has some native plants and we can get people removing invasive species and mowing at the right time of year, that's amazing. If there's a power line cut that has some native species, get rid of those invasives, talk to the power line company about not mowing at the wrong time of year, and we can turn these spaces into, again, the equivalent of a wildlife sanctuary or national park. It doesn't have to be expensive. We just have to have this all in our minds. I'm going to stick around for questions. This is what it's all about. Sorry, I forgot about this slide. I'm going to stick around for questions. I also am going to have a slide up here with my contact information on it. So if you have something you'd like to reach out about or a question I don't get to field, please feel free to send me an email. That's everything.
Okay, well, you've just done such a good job. We don't have any questions yet.
Well, I think we will. Barbara, can you start your video so I can at least show your face?
Oh, yeah, I have.
Oh, I don't see it.
I
Oh,
need to stop
there it
sharing.
is. There it is.
Yeah.
I just wanted to be able to. Here, I'll add her to the spotlight too. So we have two of you. Actually, since you don't have a question, I have one. I know that I never realized that a lot of caterpillars produce pollinators when they pupate. Is there with the problem with bees where we're killing them off with chemicals and there seem to be things that are causing beehives to just die? Is there a chance that with good biodiversity, the caterpillars and the their flying adults could take over some of the loss from the lack of bees?
I think from following some of the stories I've told, I think one of the take-home messages is things are complicated, right? None of these stories are linear. It's never going to be so simple as bee and flower, right? There's all kinds of players. Or, in addition, it's never just going to be one species that can sustain us or the world around us. So with the bees, as you're talking about them with sort of colony decline, colony collapse, that's going to be the honeybee, which is a non-native species here, more important for maybe our agriculture than for the natural world. Let's see, just trying to think of how to put this all together. We really do need to always think more broadly like that. It's not going to be the caterpillars and their pollinators they produce taking over for the honeybees. We need to preserve and promote all of these bees and all of these insects because together they support each other. So we're never going to have good luck supporting a native bumblebee until we learn how to promote and protect environments that support them and all the things that interact with them. Does that make any sense? I'm not sure I did a good job there.
That was good.
Okay, I do have a question. Oh, they're coming in now. Do you have a good recommendation for info sources that discuss the best times to mow a meadow? And is it better to have a partial first mow and then wait a while?
Yeah, I'm not going to give specifics on time of year or anything like that, just because people are in different locations and different habitats require different things. But I'll say treating any land that you have power over as a series of smaller patches is going to make all the difference. So never mow your entire meadow once a year. So I've got these little patches of lawn that I've turned into meadow up front. And one of those patches I mow every 2 years in the fall, and the other patch I mow every year in the spring. Within that, you could just mow some strips of that 1 year, or if you diversify your management, all the creatures that you're going to kill off by mowing in the fall will be able to migrate back to that spot from the patch that you didn't mow. If you go walk around Montague Plains in Western Mass, it's a fire managed habitat. The whole place is like a giant checkerboard. They don't burn the whole place down every 10 years. They manage, patch A, B, C, D, and E slightly differently at different times of years. And that way they're preserving the maximum biodiversity. One thing that'll always be true, if whenever we're managing land, we are definitely killing a lot of little animals out there, little organisms, but it is necessary to maintain habitats that wouldn't be there without that management. So all we can really do is try to leave wells behind to repopulate what we've disturbed.
I'd have some more questions. How many caterpillars did you say were native to New England?
It's a debated question. We've been using the 3,000 species statistic. Really, there's probably another 1,000 that either haven't been seen yet in New England or haven't yet been fully described. So thousands for sure.
And then what percentage of adult birds eat insects and what percentage of baby birds eat insects?
Yeah, I tend not to talk a lot about birds eating insects, which is curious, mostly because people like Ptolemy do such a great job. So there are plenty of birds which want to eat insects year round, but where it really comes into play is birds want to eat insects, and birds specifically want to eat caterpillars during the breeding season. They feed their young caterpillars. So if you want to have birds breeding in your area, if you want those chickadees to survive and have young, you've got to have caterpillars. There's no exception.
Okay, is there a book?
Almost all of these birds need insects and caterpillars to have young successfully.
And is there a book or website recommendation for mowing and managing meadows?
I don't have one offhand. I'm going to be working on some recommendations locally. I'm working with the airport here and trying to get them to behave better. But I wish I could give you a specific recommendation, but I can't right now.
And can you recommend an area around Waltham or Boston to see a well-managed meadow for biodiversity?
After I moved up here to New Hampshire, it's harder to do that. I spend so much time hunting for caterpillars and observing all these organisms in places that aren't really managed for biodiversity at all. They're just places that aren't being messed up, I should say. I lived in South Boston for a while near the Blue Hills, and walking up and down the edges of Great Blue Hill Slope was amazing. I mean, there was life everywhere, including rare insects and birds. There's a few, Audubon sanctuaries and things out here that have put in pollinator gardens, which I really like, that are more diverse in shrubs and flowering plants than others. But I'm afraid in Eastern Massachusetts, I can't make a recommendation.
Now, if you had several acres of newly available open land, say in North Waltham, what 5 species of plants would you plant to help caterpillars?
Is someone going to give me some acres in Waltham to plant plants? Love that. So it depends if you're looking for very specialized things or a bunch of generalists, right? So if you go in and you plant spicebush and sassafras, you're going to get lots of spicebush swallowtails and Promethea giant silk moths, and you can target specifics like that. But if you want to turn this area into like the most diverse possible area with the most species, the most going on, I would really look at early successionary habitat as prime. You want a lot of young trees intermingled with some meadows edge plants growing fast, and to actually maybe cut them down every 10 years or so. So oak, black cherry, poplar, willow, there's always going to be a whole bunch that I forget, birch, these sort of classic New England trees that you might find mature in a forest. If you can create, especially near a city, an area where they're all growing up rapidly in early succession, you're going to have an incredible number of species. Mix that with a meadow that's not focused so much on very particular pollinator plants, which you can have too, but make sure you have a lot of goldenrod and aster and grasses and sedges and just a tangle of all that. And you're going to have a place I would want to come check out. The most diverse spots in these environments like Waltham and in Boston, they're always the power line cuts. they're the edges that are disturbed with young trees and sort of what many might consider trashy old goldenrod stands, even though that's what the creatures want.
Somebody wrote in here spice bush, bringing monarchs of all kinds, I assume, so.
So
That's
that's again, they're targeting a few species because we love them and want to see them. Spice bush for spice bush swallowtails, milkweed for monarchs, versus creating a larger habitat of mixed early succession trees, saplings, a tangle of different plants. I really see it more as just make sure the invasive plants don't come in and take over. I mean, anytime you get a community of wild native plants growing up next to each other, you're going to have creatures move in. You let that get taken over by buckthorn or autumn olive or black swallowwort, and all of a sudden that space has become a lot less useful to anything.
Okay, I have one more question and then a comment.
Mhm.
Where can we find insects in the wintertime?
I need to do a whole talk on that. Well, right now, luckily, it's not winter anymore, and they're showing up everywhere. In the winter, there's a ton of native moths which overwinter as adults. So anytime you have a night that's above 40 degrees, you can go out and look for sap flows. Or as I said at the beginning of the talk, you could put out some gnarly rotting banana and see those moths. As long as you're careful to put them back, you can examine under bark and under logs. There will be a lot of insects there. And then there's communities of sort of snow insects that I look for every winter. These are going to be the little tiny springtails and the things like, let's see, snow scorpion flies, snow crane flies, snow stone flies. They're out there, but it does take some doing in the wintertime.
Okay, so is Apios a favorable plant for insects? And how about Sorbus americana, mountain ash?
Again, so it depends. Any native species here is going to have its host of insects. So like mountain ash has a ton of things that use it. But mountain ash isn't a terribly good specialist plant. I don't know of any caterpillars that only use mountain ash and nothing else. Often if you just look at the family of plants you're dealing with, you'll get an idea. So anything in the oak family is going to have a ton of species using it. Anything in the cherry family is likely to have a lot using it. So mountain ash is in the cherry family and will share its caterpillars with black cherry and pin cherry and apples. Trying to think what else to say in that regard. If you go for a walk in the woods and you're looking at the native plants that grow near your home, those are valuable plants to preserve the biodiversity of your area. Sometimes all you need to do is invite them into a place in a different way. Again, if you are going to maintain a meadow and an edge, let all those plants seed. Let the gray birch and the black cherry, young white pines start pushing up all over the place. And that's the environment where you're going to get a lot of insects.
Okay, and what sort of tools do you bring with you when you go into the field?
Various tools. A net, so I can see what's flying. A whole bunch of little vials. We do collect a lot of caterpillars outside for our programs. Those are going to be the ones that we get to show things like parasitism with. You can use a beating sheet, which is a tool that biologists will use to sample diversity. So it's just basically a white sheet and a baseball bat, and you put it down beneath a plant you're interested in, you shake the branch or you whack it, and you see what falls out. That comes with the added responsibility of putting all those little creatures back on their plant, but it will teach you about what's using your plants. I do a lot of exploring from home in the form of moth lighting. So I don't know how many of you out there have heard of this before, but there's things like National Moth Week and an event called Mothapalooza and all these other ones where people put out lights and they see what moths fly in, and they're going to understand from that something about the diversity of their area that they wouldn't be able to understand any other way. So my little property down the street here, I've had over, I think I'm up to like 950 species of moth have visited that light. If I plant a new plant in the yard, I'll get a new type of moth coming in. Last year I added a 9-bark. Now I have the 9-bark specialist moth, the glorious hybrisine, using my property. Biologists will use this to sample, usually through kill traps, which I don't recommend for enjoying your native biodiversity, but just putting a UV heavy light in your porch light with a little white pillowcase underneath it, and you'll see more of the diversity of your neighborhood than any other way.
Okay, so one person, the person who asked about the things with, or talked about the things with the monarch, she said she meant to write Asclepias, yeah,
Okay.
of all
Yeah.
kinds, not monarchs. So I
Did you
just
see
wanna-
me going, wondering how to respond to that one? I'm sorry about that. Yeah, Asclepias. So again, we want to promote the specialists, right? Like I want to have the pitcher plant loopers nearby who need the purple pitcher plants, and I want to have monarchs and milkweed tussocks and the what is it called, the confused cycnia? No, the unexpected cycnia. Those all use milkweed. These are communities to celebrate, and we need to make sure milkweed and pitcher plants have a place. But they're not things we want to think about without thinking about everything else. Again, like to preserve diversity, to feed the most birds, you're not planting milkweed and pitcher plants. To feed the most birds, we're talking again, a whole bunch of young trees and goldenrods and grasses. So I would think about your property that you're trying to turn into a little preserve as a landscape that you want to fill with diversity, and then come back in afterwards and put little plots of, here's a little bog over here with my pitcher plants. Here's the milkweed patch. That way you can bring in those additional species. But don't do that above having the chaos of nature and a little patch of young trees.
Okay, so we have 2 comments. Many thanks, Sam. Keep up all your fabulous work and superb and interesting presentation. I look forward to watching it again. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
So that's it for the questions.
All
All
righty.
right, well, have a good night, everybody.
Well, we just like to leave one little reminder. Thank you so much, Sam. It was terrific. And by the way, we do have a piece of land that I think I know who was asking the question, where we've talked about a meadow, and it's a former site of it was a school, the Fernald School. And it's abandoned essentially. The city owns it, but they're not doing much. So in any event, I want to thank you and also remind people to do the survey when we close this out, and because we'd love to hear from you, and let us know where you're hearing about all these great talks we're doing. And thanks again. I'm going to end
Thank you,
it.
everybody. Thank you. Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth
Alrighty.
Day, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.